This video is on data collection in quantitative research. There are 6 common methods of data collection in quantitative research. One of those is tests. Tests generally are quantitative, but there may be some qualitative components to a test. And that may be something like an essay question or short answer, or anything that doesn't have those standardized response patterns. There's also questionnaires. Most questionnaires are, again, quantitative. You're trying to get people's opinion on a topic, on an issue, on an experience, but again, they may have some qualitative component, an essay, a free response question, or possibly an interview component, depending on the style of the questionnaire. There's also interviews. Interviews are largely qualitative, but there can be some quantitative components, particularly if you are doing a standardized interview that's intended to last a very short amount of time. So something that may be interviewing 100 people. That is more likely to actually be a quantitative analysis rather than the qualitative in-depth analysis. We also have, as we mentioned before, focus groups, which are generally qualitative, although it's again possible to do them in a quantitative manner, but those generally will be quantized qualitative data. So you'll do the study in entirety with the focus group and then repeat that study over and over and look for the major themes that are statistically significant from that population. But again, that blurs that line. Is it really just one study at that point? There's also observation, which oftentimes are qualitative when looking at humans, but when looking at other animals, we generally use quantitative approaches to our observations. And that is done sometimes in human studies, but perhaps not as often as simply observing behavior and recording the noteworthy aspects, particularly if the observer and the observed are of the same cultural background. They often have a lot of unspoken understanding of what's going on in that situation. And then the last way we can collect data is through secondary data or existing data. And that generally will come from another study or another individual. For instance, I'm working with a lot of secondary data right now from IPEDS, Integrated Post-Secondary Data System. And that's giving a lot of really useful insights, but I did not go out and collect the data from each school. That data was collected for other purposes and then is publicly released, so I can then use that data in my analysis. So what method are you going to use? Well, your method for data collection largely depends on your research problem and research question. You need to know if the data collection method will give you answers to the questions you're asking. You don't want to use a test if your question is on the lived experience of a set of individuals. The test is going to result in standardized outcomes rather than allowing for nuance and deeper understanding of that experience. You're also going to have to focus on what method you've selected for your overall analysis. So are you looking at a qualitative or quantitative lens? You probably don't want to use a test if you're looking at a qualitative question or a question about people's experience. You also need to think about who your participants are going to be. If your participants will be hundreds of individuals, you do not want to be doing any kind of large-scale qualitative study because you're not going to be able to go as in-depth. It would take years or possibly decades to get through a proper qualitative study with that many individuals. And that's just because of the amount of time it takes to do, for instance, 3 repeated interviews that are spaced appropriately apart. If you are doing any kind of data collection with individuals of an already marginalized population and you are of the majority population, in whatever setting that happens to be, you need to think about, are you going to be able to elicit authentic responses? For instance, I probably should not be the one interviewing someone for instance, Venda or Zulu South African on their experience with racial injustice in South Africa. I look a bit too much like the colonizers, both the Dutch and the English. So it probably wouldn't be they probably wouldn't be as forthcoming with me as they would with another um, Black or Indigenous South African. You also need to consider how mixing and matching different sets of data, different data collection methods, might improve your research design. And there's two ways of doing this. There's inter-method and intra-method. Inter-method uses two or more data collection methods within a single study. For instance, a qualitative focus group and a quantitative questionnaire, or a test that's standardized on a large group of people, and then qualitative interviews with a smaller subset of that group who took the test. Intramethod, on the other hand, uses both quantitative and qualitative data coming from a single data collection source. So, for instance, you could use a mixed methods questionnaire where you have those quantitative standardized questions and the qualitative free response questions. You could also do an observational study where you are counting frequencies of behavior in a systematic, standardized way, but also describing that behavior, describing what it looks like and how it plays out in detail from that qualitative perspective. So there are some cardinal rules that apply when collecting data. First off, always be thinking about what multiple sources of evidence you need to adequately support or explain your research question or research hypotheses. If you are collecting evidence that doesn't support the research question or the research agenda or the project as a whole, why are you collecting that data? Is it necessary? Is it something that you need to have? If it's a part of a larger overall research agenda or overall study, for instance, you're collecting data for a specific outcome, but you're collecting a little extra data because you know in the future you're going to need that data. Then you'll want to make sure that that is in line with both your current research objective and your long-term research objective. Think about which data collection methods give you the best evidence to answer your question, whether that's qualitative or quantitative. You also need to be able to rule out any alternative explanations. So when you have your quantitative data and you only have quantitative data, you're not necessarily going to be able to rule out an alternate explanation that has to do with something like intersectionality or something that has to do with the lived experiences of the individuals or their learned behaviors. That's not going to be something that quantitative data can elicit. You may be able to come to some kind of generalizations or some kind of explanation, but you have no way to double check if that is authentic, or are you just projecting this onto your study participants rather than having them tell you about their experience or their perspective on an issue? We need to be thinking about how our tests can be useful in data collection. Generally speaking, tests are best when you need a large number of repeated measures. So you need a large number of data points. It can be on things like attitudes, personality, self-perception, aptitude, performance, anything like that. But keep in mind that standardized tests are the most common because they have very strong psychometric properties. What we mean by that is there's high reliability, high validity, and high ability to group based on normed behaviors or expected answers rather than open-ended and not being able to compare between populations. So those standardized tests are very useful in a limited setting. They cannot answer everything. If a standardized test already exists for whatever your variable is, for whatever data you are trying to collect to answer your question, consider using it. You do want to double check the psychometric properties. Was it proven to be reliable currently or in the past decade? Um, has it been used with your study population? For instance, I have a standardized measure of student cultural competence that I've been administering to um, college level undergraduate anthropology students, but it hasn't been validated on any community college population in the United States. It has been validated in Singapore, in Germany, and at certain elite institutions in the US, but not in a diverse community college setting. So I'm using this standardized measure knowing that it may fall short of what has been published before. And so you have to be prepared for that kind of, yes, it's valid, but maybe not for my population. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're designing and analyzing the data. If you're creating a test, you have to make sure it's tailored to who is going to be taking the test and the context from which it's being studied. Again, going back to that example of cultural competency in the anthropology classroom. Since it hasn't been used in that context, I have to test it, I have to apply it, and do a lot more preliminary work than just analyzing the results and reporting the findings. Some strengths of using tests. Tests provide measures of characteristics, and they may provide more accurate measures or more robust measures. They're often standardized in a way that lets you get to that underlying trait or that underlying concept or construct. So, something like satisfaction, intelligence, scholastic aptitude. Um, they may or may not be measuring what they say they are measuring or what they think they are measuring, but they are standardized and definitely measuring something. It can also allow you to have a common measure across different research populations. Again, you may be using it to gather data on um, Black individuals in South Africa who are indigenous to South Africa, and you may apply it to the same, at least from the American perspective, the same demographics, Black individuals in Louisiana, and be able to compare the amount of, say, African cultural experience or authentic African cultural experience or something like that. But it allows for that common comparison point. And because of those strong psychometric properties, we can have strong confidence in the conclusions that are drawn, as long as the conclusions are only in line with the data and you're not, again, projecting your thoughts or opinions onto the data, which is unfortunately very frequent. Tests also give us a reference group of data. So if it's been used before with other populations, you can reference that and say, okay, well, my population is more like this other group, um, and yet their response patterns are like this third separate group. That can give you some insight into the experiences or follow-up studies that might be needed. Tests also can be administered in large groups. So you can give a test to hundreds, thousands of individuals quickly. Whereas if you were trying to do that many interviews or focus groups, yeah, good luck doing that before your time has expired. Um, Tests can also provide hard quantitative data because people have a perception that quantitative data is more reliable or more carries more weight than qualitative data. In the real world, you need both, but there is that perspective. And so, if you are able to say, we are going to use a standardized test paired with interviews, it gives a more robust appearance to the research, which can be helpful in attracting funders or in attracting participants as well. And one other major strength is that tests are typically already developed. There's probably a test out there for anything you can think of that you want to measure in an individual. It may or may not be a great test, it may or may not be something you agree with, but it is probably out there. And because there are so many different tests, again, you can probably find more than one that will work for a given research study. If you're administering the tests as a group, so in a group setting where you're handing it out to everyone at the same time and collecting it all at the same time, you generally get an extremely high response rate. And that's because people are right there with you and you're giving it within the confines of a setting, a classroom, a program, a meeting. You're giving it in some kind of setting where people don't necessarily think of or feel like it's appropriate to just not participate. Of course, as researchers, ethically, we have to give them the option of not participating or not answering questions. But generally speaking, compared to other methods, tests administered in group settings will have some of the highest response rates. Also, it makes it very easy for us to analyze data because it's intended to be quantitative. It's easy to apply statistics to something that was designed for statistics to be applied to. However, for all of their strengths, tests have some significant weaknesses. It can be extraordinarily expensive to purchase tests for each research participant. One test that I was looking at using for my cultural competency study was going to be $30 per participant per administration, which doesn't sound too bad. So you have 10 people, that's $300. Okay, that's fine. Our classes at the community college level generally are 15 to 20 individuals. Okay, so a little more, maybe $600. But then you want to repeat that measure 3 times across 5 different sections of a course, and you need to do that for a full year to get a true growth trajectory. That rapidly becomes prohibitively expensive. You can also have social desirability affecting your response rates and responses. People may give the response that they think is correct or they think is socially acceptable, regardless of whether or not that is the response they authentically consider correct or that most matches their perception or experience. Tests also may not be appropriate for a local or a unique population, especially if it was developed for a very different population. And that may have to do with language, that may have to do with cultural beliefs or approaches, and that may not be something that an outsider can necessarily be aware of beforehand. So if you do administer a test and you're getting all kinds of wonky results, keep in mind the context in which the test was developed and the context in which it was administered. Those may be important follow-up lines of evidence. You can also use open-ended questions, but generally speaking, especially for a standardized assessment or test, you don't have the ability to do any kind of probing or any kind of back and forth. You may get some open-ended questions, but it's relatively rare, especially in the standardized test sphere. And tests are normally biased against certain groups of people. They have differential response rates, differential difficulty depending on the population. And so the biases, we say sometimes biased. In reality, all tests are biased. It's just how much and towards whom that matters. It also can matter in the scoring of the assessment. So there are ways to kind of correct for that scoring to say, okay, for this population, let's say the students in the advanced chemistry course versus the remedial chemistry course, you can administer the same test and get results that show bias towards the advanced chemistry group, but you may still be able to interpret those results because that's expected in that setting, and you simply don't grade the same way you score. So you score the test based on that standardized measure, and then you can norm it to each group separately and give grades or assign grades based on that group difference rather than the whole of the population. But that can get kind of sticky, especially for high impact tests. things like the SAT, ACT. There's also the issue of non-response to certain items. If they don't respond, is that a wrong answer or is that some other kind of answer? Um, that can be difficult to deal with in the quantitative sphere. And some tests simply lack psychometric data. If you're developing a test for a course, there's probably not psychometrics on that test. That's part of why, as a K 12 teacher, I always advocated that we needed supplementary resources published by the textbook publishers because those test questions had been piloted, had been reviewed, had been analyzed psychometrically. So you knew that the test questions had a level of reliability that teacher generated tests generally don't, and that's because teacher generated tests are generally brand new. So, moving on from the standardized test world, questionnaires can be similarly extremely useful, and they're generally self report data that participants will fill out the questionnaire either through an online system or in person. And it gives you information about those thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, anything that's personal and individual to the person, but you think is going to be relatively constant throughout groups. So, for instance, you may have a measure of thoughts or political ideologies, and you're administering it to a group of likely Republican and likely Democratic voters. They are probably going to have certain things in common across all populations, but then each group is going to have more in common within that subgroup. Questionnaires often work best when they're mixed with other methods of data collection, particularly either interviews or focus groups. So ultimately, what is the difference between a test and a questionnaire? It largely has to do with that self-report aspect of a questionnaire versus a test. Tests generally are measuring something about the individual, whether that's depression or math content knowledge or cultural competency or intelligence. Whereas questionnaires are more about someone's beliefs or attitudes or feelings rather than a trait they hold. Hopefully that distinction makes a bit of sense. So, questionnaires can be very good for measuring attitudes and eliciting other content from participants. So, especially if you're having people fill out a questionnaire and then do a short interview afterwards, that can be extremely powerful when paired together. Questionnaires generally are also inexpensive, they generally aren't too long, and because of that, you can get a fairly high response rate. Questionnaires can also provide information about participants' internal feelings and ways of thinking in a way that a standardized test generally cannot. So it gives you some of that qualitative information in a quantitative measure. It can be administered to probability samples, so you can do it intentionally so that your sample represents the full population. The small segment of the individuals who you're able to give the questionnaire to matches the larger demographics of the region or of the city or of the campus, and so you can get statistically valid results. Because most of them are self-report, you can have a relatively quick turnaround. Sometimes in as little as 5 minutes, you can get data, and depending on the length of the questionnaire and the size of the data set, you might be able to actually start analyzing data the same day that the questionnaire is launched. Questionnaires can also be administered to groups to look for those specific group differences in response rates, in patterns of responses, in willingness to participate. And the perceived anonymity of of questionnaires generally is high because, especially when these are administered online or in any kind of virtual format where there is no name attached, people feel very anonymized and may be more willing to elicit authentic responses in a questionnaire setting versus a test setting where the name or the occupation of the individual is known from the outset. Questionnaires have moderately high measurement validity for well-constructed questionnaires, so they can border on standardized tests, but standardized tests have more in the sphere of setting. So there's a standardized process. You have to go into the Prometric Testing Center to take the GRE, and you have to check in and go through this standardized setup and with a computer that is identical to the computer that everyone else in the testing center is using, those kinds of things. Questionnaires generally don't have that level of standardization, but the questions, the way they are asked, can be very standardized. Closed-ended items can give you the exact information that you are looking for as the researcher to answer your research questions. If they're, again, a well-constructed questionnaire that is intentionally designed. Open-ended items, on the other hand, can give you details about the participants' responses in their own words, but doing so in a way that's extremely easy to analyze and collect all of that data because it's generally within a single system. For us, in this class, it's going to be through Google Forms, but in other cases, it may be Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or any of the other questionnaire formats. And questionnaires can be very useful for exploration because of that open-ended component that can be incorporated, as well as confirmation. Do we think we're doing a good job with our customer satisfaction? What do customers say? We think we can improve in these areas. Do customers agree, yes or no? Questionnaires, though, usually have to be kept short. If your questionnaire is too long, people will not be completing it. And you may have reactive effects occurring. For instance, interviewees may try to only show what is socially desirable. The same can happen with a questionnaire, especially in the open-ended response section. You can also, just like in tests, have the issue of non-response items. If they failed to respond to an item, is that the lowest response category? Is it a separate response category? It's something that can throw things off. And if they didn't answer a single question, but they answered all other portions of your questionnaire, do you drop that individual entirely because they are missing one item? Or do you include it all except that item? And that can get into the statistical analyses and all that kind of stuff. But it's an issue to be considered in your research design. Questionnaires often rely on memory and self-awareness. So if an individual is not very self-aware or has a bad memory, they may or may not be entirely accurate because perception rarely equals reality. Response rates may be low for any kind of mail or emailed questionnaire. However, that's generally true for anything that you send by mail or email. So it's an issue, but not necessarily a deal breaker. Open-ended items can not only reflect differences in their experience or their true thoughts or feelings, but it can also reflect a difference in language ability. It can reflect a difference in verbal articulation as well as just comfort with the language. So if you are administering a questionnaire in English to a group of diverse students from diverse language backgrounds, some of whom may be very recent immigrants to the United States or to the English-speaking world, then you're going to have some issues because you may rate them as lower on those open-ended response items because of their difference in language ability rather than a true difference in their experience or their perception. For open-ended items especially, data analysis can take a very, very, very long time. I was on a project earlier this year that was doing an evaluation of a scholarship program for blended and online students. In that questionnaire application, essentially, that students submitted for a scholarship, there were over 750 essays that had to be qualitatively coded. Fortunately, I am the quantitative side of things, so I got to say, "Oh, thank you, research partner. Would you please do this? I am so sorry." And my research partner was kind enough to do so. Um, it took her almost a month to get through 750 essays and rigorously qualitatively code them. It took a very long time, and I do not envy the people who have to do that. Another weakness is that the measure might need validation, especially if it's not coming from a standardized questionnaire or measure. When we get to observation, watching the behavioral patterns of people in a certain context to give information about that phenomenon or that experience. Um, the observer, though, needs to aim for unobtrusiveness. We can never be totally separate from what we are observing. We are a part of the setting. But you could aim to be as unobtrusive as possible. You could aim to be just another person at the park and not really appear as if you are doing intensive observations of individuals. Observations are used to determine what people actually do in a given situation versus a questionnaire or a test, which is what people say that they do. And again, as always in social science research, perception rarely equals reality. So they may perceive that they are behaving in a certain way, but an external observer may not agree. Observations are usually collected in addition to that self-report data, which allows you to do that kind of comparison between self-report and observed behavior, perception versus reality. And these can be conducted in different settings. It can be in a laboratory setting or in a natural setting. And by laboratory, we don't mean the chemistry lab with the beakers and all of the fun stuff. By laboratory setting, we really just mean a standardized setting, a interview room or a trailer that is used for these interviews with different kinds of recording apparatus that gives you the external observation, the recorded situation, and the interview setting. So it gives you kind of the strengths of both. In a quantitative observation, we're using a standardized procedure to get reliable research data. It standardizes the who, what, when, where, and how of that observation. And it does involve extensive training for the observers because you have to have that high inter-rater reliability. What I call nervousness, you need to also be calling nervousness and not aggressiveness. What I call, and this goes back to my experience doing research on primates in South Africa, what I call a feeding behavior in a monkey, you also need to be calling feeding behavior and not environmental exploration. What I call social contact or what I call grooming behavior, you also need to be calling social contact or grooming behavior rather than resting or sleeping. That seems a little abstract, but when applied to humans, the same concept holds true, that we need to be using the same definitions for these observations if they are quantitative in nature. Usually this is tied to collecting quantitative data, counts and frequencies, using closed-in instruments for some kind of confirmatory purpose. So you're using the instrument in a standardized method because you already have a theory or some kind of other study that says what you should be looking for. This may be observational sampling, which can be time interval sampling. So you're looking for behavioral events at specific time points, for instance, every 5 minutes. So at the 5-minute mark, you're recording behavior and just whatever's kind of a snapshot of the setting at that time interval. But you can also have event sampling. Instead of looking at every 5 minutes and recording what's going on exactly at that 5 minute mark, you can instead be looking for specific behaviors. So you may be looking at, in, for instance, a teacher observation, how many times do they walk to one side of the room versus the other side of the room? So it doesn't matter when they're moving to that side of the room, it matters if they are. So you record every single time that happens rather than where are they at different increments of time. Observations do allow you to directly see behavior instead of relying on people's self-report of behavior. They give you that firsthand experience, especially if the observer is an observer participant. So the observer is not purely external, as they would be in something like a recorded interview, where the observer is just watching the discussion rather than being a part of the discussion. But if you're participating in it, you also can get some of that qualitative data just from your own personal experience in the setting. Observational studies can provide relatively objective measures of behavior if they are quantized. But an observer can determine what doesn't occur. Are they, is the participant, the teacher, for instance, in the case of teacher evaluations, are they never answering questions from certain individuals? That can not really be gauged as easily by a survey, but it can be observed and telling you what doesn't occur or what the observer expected to occur and doesn't. The observer might see things that escape the awareness of people in that setting, particularly in the case of recorded interviews. The external observer will often observe facial features or body language that the person doing the interview may not have noticed for whatever reason. So it can kind of give you that second set of eyes that people might not be aware of in real time. It can also be an excellent way to discover what's occurring in a setting. For instance, let's say you're doing an observation of students at a park. Are the students preferring different playground equipment? Are they playing different games that you may or may not even be aware of? Especially with kids, kids will make up games and play them in all kinds of crazy ways. So it can let you observe and explore what's going on in that setting rather than projecting what you expect to see onto that setting. And it helps you understand the importance of those contextual factors in your study. If there's a change in the setting, the observer can see it and see how people respond to that change, whereas an active participant may not be able to. It can also be used for participants with weak verbal skills, either because of language differences or because of age, either too young or too old. Observation can provide information on things people might otherwise not be willing to discuss. An observer may also move beyond selective perceptions of people in the setting, so it may give them more objectivity than people who are actually experiencing that setting. Observational studies can be very good for description, especially if you're trying to describe the context that's involved in a given situation. Um, and it can provide a moderate degree of realism, especially when done outside of the laboratory in a more natural setting, like going to the park with a bunch of kids. Just if you are doing something like that, make sure that it is well documented. There were settings that in the past where students actually did go out and observe students on a playground, but without discussing it with the school beforehand or getting any kind of informed consent. And so the professor had to have a long conversation with the school at which the observation occurred, and with the police who came, because if a stranger is sitting and staring at a bunch of kids, people get worried, and rightfully so. So if it's done in a natural setting and done unobtrusively, where the observer actually does not affect the participants and does not attract undue attention, it can provide much more realistic outcomes. But observations can tell us what we see people doing, but it can't tell us why they are doing that. Any rationale or reason for the behavior might not be immediately clear. We also do get reactive effects. When people are being watched, they change their behavior. That's not true just for people, that's true for all animals. Um, Once you know you're being observed, you're more aware of yourself, you're more aware of your surroundings. You may behave in a way that is not authentic to how you would be behaving if you knew you weren't being observed or you didn't think you were being observed. It's a fairly universal thing across primates and many animals where they don't like being stared at. Pretty much no one likes that. No animal likes that. It's going to be uncomfortable and it is going to affect people's behavior. Um, the observation relies on what is observed. Um, People that are being observed might be behaving in atypical ways or ways that aren't typical for them, but they're behaving that way in that setting on the day you happen to be observing. They're having an off day. They're really hyper that day, what have you. The investigator has personal biases that they're going to bring into the setting, and they may have some kind of um, implicit bias, a bias they're not aware of, or a way of recording those observations that differentially favor one group over another. And that may not be something that's malicious or intentional. That may be something like the observer finds one of the participants to be very attractive. They end up focusing on them. They may not even realize that that is what has occurred until well after the fact. And so it may bias the results that are being presented. The observer may also, quote unquote, go native, which is something we see in ethnographic work as well, where they're over identifying with the group being studied and losing that objectivity. Sampling of observed people and settings might be limited. You may not be able to observe people in all settings at all times. You may not be able to observe the 5 a.m. train from Union Station to DIA all the time. And even if you are able to observe that at all times, are you able to see the entire train at any given time? I would hazard a guess as to no, you would not be able to. And so there has to be a limiting of what is being observed. You can't really observe large or dispersed populations. You can't keep track of that many people in your field of view. Once you get over certain limits in different settings, it's too many people. You can't keep track of them. Talk to anyone who is going through a teacher ed program, and they will probably be able to give you examples of when it just got to be too much and they couldn't keep track of everything. Some settings and content of interest can't be observed. We cannot go and observe people's behavior in some kind of private setting, something like the signing of legal documents or the sensitive negotiations in some kind of business setting. So if it's not able to be observed, then you can't observe it and you don't have any data all of a sudden. Collection of unimportant material might be moderately high, especially if you're going into an observation without any kind of standardized method. You may have a lot of information that's like, that was really interesting information about those birds, but I was really more concerned with the homeless population in this park, not the birds, but for some reason I ended up with all this data about the birds. No idea why. Observational studies also might be more expensive, especially if you're trying to apply them to a large population when compared to something like questionnaires or tests. Um, and data analysis, paired with being more expensive, data analysis can also be more time consuming and often thus more expensive as well. So there's a way to go about this, collecting similar information without the individual doing the observing, and that's to collect visual data. It's like observational data, but it's taken using photographs or videos, and it takes place um, either with the photos as the observer or the photo taker as the participant. There was a research study done in Commerce City with low-income youth where the researchers gave these students, because they were students at a local school, they gave them a disposable camera and had them go out and take pictures of what they thought represented their community. In that situation, the photos are acting as the participants because the participants are the ones who chose which photos to take and explained why they took those photos. That was an example of photo interviewing, also photo elicitation, where you are having the people explain why they took those photos or give additional information about a photo. That can be useful both in something like when the individual is taking those photos, but it can also be used to gain additional information in something like a family history interview, where you have photos of houses that people lived in or photos of individuals who are no longer around, and it may give you more depth to that interview process. It can also lead you to different or alternative interpretations of the phenomenon because you have what someone said before they saw the picture and then what their response was after. So it can give you not, I don't want to say more accurate, but it can give you different perceptions and different data that can be just as important. And participants can be the ones who are given the cameras or asked for the photos. What's a photo of a time you felt really excited? Or take a photo of something that makes you very excited. And then people can go in whatever direction they feel is appropriate. The last of these methods is secondary or existing data. This is data that's collected for a different study or a different purpose that is then kind of reduced, reused, and recycled into a new study. The data can be constructed data. So you can have, for instance, responses to a questionnaire. You psychometrically analyze them, and then from that data, you apply additional analyses. So it's kind of a double step in the data analysis. Often we do this with other data to corroborate findings. So you may use data in a study, and then that data may be used again in a different study to corroborate the findings of the first study, something like a quantitative follow-up to a qualitative interview. So types of secondary data we can gather with things like documents, personal documents, journals, diaries, memos. But you can also have letters, newspapers, annual reports. There can also be physical data, physical traces left by people who took part in activities. And with a background in anthropology, and I'm also an editor on a open source archaeology textbook, this can be extremely useful once those individuals are no longer around. Either they're deceased or they've moved on to another place. Physical data can tell us an extraordinary amount of how people lived and what they believed, felt, encouraged. Um, you can look at wear and tear on items or material culture items. What do people have in their purse or in their backpack? Why do they have that? What does it tell you about their experience and their beliefs? You can also use archived research data from other research that's been stored for later use. Normally, this is quantitative data, but not always. Um, you may have 10 years worth of student behavior data from an online system. You may have census data. Yes, the census data is collected for a specific purpose, but it can be used in many other research settings.